The day everything changed. Mason Wright suppressed a yawn as Professor Kilder's 3 sets of appendages manipulated the holographic display at the front of the amphitheater. The Centaurian educator was droning on about interspecies diplomatic protocols, a subject that should have been fascinating but somehow managed to be mind-numbingly dull in execution. And so, when addressing a Phoraxian ambassador, one must always maintain exactly 2.7 meters of personal space, while simultaneously, Mason's attention drifted to the curved crystalline windows that lined the lecture hall. Beyond them, the 3 moons of Argos Prime hung like jewels in the violet sky, casting their pale light over the gleaming spires of the Galactic Academy. Even after 6 months as the first, and only, human exchange student at the most prestigious educational institution in the Orion Arm, the view still took his breath away. A sharp jab to his ribs snapped him back to attention. "She asked you a question," hissed Zix, the Avarian student beside him. With feathers that shifted between emerald and sapphire depending on the light, Zix was one of the few classmates who'd bothered to befriend the primitive primate from Earth. "I apologize, Professor," Mason said, straightening in his seat. "Could you repeat the question?" Professor Kilder's primary eyes narrowed while her secondary set continued monitoring the holographic display. "I asked exchange student Wright about Earth's protocols for first contact scenarios. Your species is relatively new to interstellar diplomacy, yet has managed to forge unusually productive alliances despite your technological limitations." Several suppressed chitters and hums of amusement rippled through the lecture hall, particularly from the Teslarian contingent in the back row. Mason had grown used to being the butt of jokes. Humans were seen as curiosities at best, primitives at worst. "Actually, Professor," Mason replied, sitting straighter, "Earth has extensively prepared for extraterrestrial encounters for centuries before actual contact occurred. We have thousands of theoretical protocols, simulations, and contingency plans for various scenarios, including hostile ones." This drew outright laughter from several students. Kelvax, a hulking draconian with metallic scales, let out a particularly dismissive snort. "Contingency plans? For what?" Kelvax rumbled. "Your species barely mastered fusion propulsion. What hostile scenario could you possibly have prepared for?" Mason shrugged. "Invasion, resource theft, biological contamination, cultural subversion, the usual." Professor Kilder's mouthparts clicked in what Mason had come to recognize as academic interest. "Fascinating. Humans developed invasion protocols before developing war capabilities. Most species focus exclusively on technological advancement and only consider security protocols after achieving interstellar travel. We've always been good at anticipating trouble," Mason said with a slight smile, "and preparing for it." Kelvax wasn't satisfied. "So your primitive species wasted resources on imaginary scenarios instead of advancing your technology. No wonder you." The Draconian's insult was cut short by a low, thrumming vibration that shook the entire chamber. The holographic display flickered, then dissolved into static. Professor Kilder's primary eyes widened in alarm. "That's not possible," she whispered, her secondary eyes darting to the security panel embedded in her lectern. The vibration intensified. Fine cracks appeared in the crystalline windows. "Professor?" asked Zix, feathers flattening in distress. "What's happening?" Before Keldra could answer, the Academy's AI spoke through the communication system, its usually melodious voice now clipped and urgent. "Security breach in sectors 7 through 13. Unidentified vessels have breached atmospheric defenses. All students proceed to designated safety zones. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not." The message cut off abruptly as the lights failed. Emergency illumination bathed the room in a blood-red glow. In the silence that followed, Mason heard a sound he recognized from countless historical simulations: weapons fire. Not the clean hum of Galactic Union energy weapons, but something cruder, more vicious. "Everyone get down," Mason shouted, diving toward the nearest console just as the far wall exploded inward. Through the dust and debris, armored figures poured into the lecture hall. Their exoskeletons were a nightmarish fusion of chitin and metal, with multiple limbs ending in serrated claws or energy weapons. Mason had never seen this species before, but their intent was unmistakable. "Vrexians," gasped Professor Keldra, her color fading to a sickly gray. "How did they get past our defenses?" The invaders scanned the room with compound eyes that glowed an eerie yellow. The lead Vrexian raised what appeared to be a command device and clicked out a series of harsh sounds. Translation programs throughout the room struggled to interpret. All sentients will submit for processing. Resistance results in immediate termination. Panic erupted. Students tried to flee, only to be herded back by the Vrexians' energy weapons. Some of the braver ones, including Kelvax, attempted to fight, but their untrained efforts were swiftly and brutally suppressed. Mason remained crouched behind the console, mind racing. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, but it was also eerily familiar. This scenario, hostile invasion of an educational facility, was one he'd drilled for countless times during Earth's mandatory emergency response training. Different context, same principles. He caught Zix's eye and motioned for the Avarian to stay low and move toward him. "What are they?" Mason whispered once Zix had slithered close enough. "I've never heard of Vrexians." "Hive mind nomads from the outer rim," Zix replied, voice trembling. "They raid advanced civilizations for technology and resources. They're supposed to be contained beyond the quantum barrier. This shouldn't be possible." Mason's eyes narrowed as he studied the invaders' movements. Despite their fearsome appearance, he noticed their tactics were surprisingly basic, standard intimidation and control procedures. They were well armed but predictable. "They're herding everyone into groups," he observed, "probably for easier transport. Once they've secured the campus, they'll start stripping it for anything valuable, including us." "What do we do?" Zix whispered. "The Union Defense Force won't arrive for hours, even if they received a distress call." Mason scanned the room, assessing resources, exits, and the distribution of Vrexian forces. His emergency training kicked in, presenting options and probabilities with surprising clarity. "We need to disrupt their command structure," he said, pointing to the lead Vrexian, who was now interfacing with the classroom's central terminal. "These hive species typically rely on hierarchical communications. If we can isolate the units in this room from their coordinator, we might be able to create enough confusion to escape." Zix's feathers rippled with nervous energy. "How exactly do we do that? They're armed and armored, and we're just students." Mason's eyes fixed on the environmental control panel near Professor Kildra's position. The Centaurian educator caught his gaze and subtly tilted her head in question. "Atmospheric regulation," Mason mouthed, pointing discreetly. Understanding dawned in the professor's multiple eyes. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. "When I give the signal," Mason whispered to Zix, "grab as many students as you can and head for the maintenance tunnels behind the lecture stations. The access panel is camouflage, but it's there." "What signal?" Zix asked. Mason's lips quirked in a grim smile. "You'll know it." He began slowly maneuvering around the edge of the room, keeping to the shadows cast by the emergency lighting. When he reached a supply cabinet, he carefully opened it and retrieved a handful of chemical light sticks used for practical demonstrations. The Vrexians were now systematically scanning each student with handheld devices, presumably cataloging them for processing. They had yet to notice Mason's absence from the huddled groups. Mason caught Professor Kilder's eye again and held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. The professor slammed her primary appendage onto the environmental control panel. Immediately, the room's atmospheric systems went into emergency purge mode, a safety feature designed to clear toxins in case of a laboratory accident. Powerful vents in the ceiling blasted the room with high-pressure air, creating a momentary cyclone of dust and debris. In the same instant, Mason snapped and threw all the chemical light sticks, which flared with blinding intensity when exposed to the room's suddenly oxygen-rich atmosphere. The Vrexians reeled, their compound eyes extremely sensitive to the rapid changes in light and pressure. Their coordinated movements dissolved into confusion as their sensory organs were overloaded. "Now," Mason shouted. Chaos erupted, but this time with purpose. Zix shot toward the nearest group of students, guiding them toward the hidden maintenance access. Professor Keldra used her multiple limbs to remarkable effect, swiftly moving from console to console, triggering emergency protocols that further disoriented the invaders. Mason sprinted directly toward the lead Vrexian, who was still struggling to regain equilibrium. With a technique taught in Earth's mandatory self-defense classes, he targeted the join between the creature's natural carapace and artificial armor, a universal weak point in most exoskeleton designs. The Vrexian commander went down hard, its command device skittering across the floor. Mason scooped it up and smashed it against the nearest wall, severing whatever control signal it had been transmitting. The effect was immediate. The other Vrexians froze momentarily, then began moving in erratic, uncoordinated patterns, like puppets with tangled strings. They're temporarily cut off from the hive. Mason called out, "Everyone move. Now." Students who moments ago had been paralyzed with fear now rushed toward the maintenance access that Zix had managed to open. Kelvax, nursing a wounded limb, gave Mason a look of stunned reassessment before helping shepherd smaller students into the escape route. Mason held position, ensuring everyone made it through. Professor Keldra was the last faculty member remaining, her limbs still dancing across the emergency systems. "Professor, we need to go," Mason called. "One moment," she replied, her digits flying across interfaces. "I'm triggering quarantine protocols throughout the academy. It won't stop them, but it will slow their progress and might save lives in other sectors." A recovered Vrexian soldier lunged at her, energy weapon raised. Mason reacted instinctively, grabbing a broken piece of equipment and hurling it with precision. The projectile struck the weapon, causing it to discharge harmlessly into the ceiling. Before the Vrexian could recover, Professor Keldra lashed out with surprising speed, her normally delicate appendages striking with practiced precision at the invader's neural clusters. The Vrexian collapsed, twitching. Mason stared in shock. Contrary to popular belief, Professor Keldra said with dignity as she straightened her academic robes, "Centaurians do have a military history. I taught cynobiological defense before diplomacy." Together, they sprinted for the maintenance access just as the remaining Vrexians began to reorganize. The access panel slid shut behind them, plunging them into the dimly lit maintenance tunnels, where the rest of the class waited in terrified silence. "What now?" Zix asked, feathers still trembling. Mason looked at the frightened faces around him, species from across the galaxy, each with unique abilities and knowledge. In the soft glow of the tunnel's emergency lighting, he saw not just fear, but a growing resolve. "Now," he said with quiet determination, "we fight back." The counterattack. The maintenance tunnels beneath the Galactic Academy stretched for kilometers, a labyrinthine network designed to service the massive educational complex. Originally built to accommodate maintenance drones, the passageways were cramped for most species, particularly Kelvax, whose massive frame required him to hunch uncomfortably as the group moved. Mason led from the front, his human night vision proving surprisingly superior to many of his alien classmates in the dim emergency lighting. Behind him, 23 students from 17 different species and 2 faculty members followed in tense silence, broken only by occasional whispers and the sound of Kelvax's scales scraping against the tunnel ceiling. "Do you actually have a plan?" the Draconian rumbled after they'd been moving for nearly 20 minutes. "Or are we just running until we can't anymore?" Mason paused at a junction, consulting the maintenance schematic that Professor Keldra had downloaded to his datapad before they fled. "We're heading for the Central Archives," he said. "It's one of the most secure facilities on campus, with its own power supply and defense systems, and a direct connection to the quantum communication array. added Professor Kildare. If we can reach it, we might be able to send a clear distress signal to the Union Defense Force. Zix, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly perked up. Wait, I just realized something. Today is the Founders' Commemoration. The Central Archives will be displaying the Nexus Codex. Several students gasped. Even Mason, with his limited knowledge of galactic history, recognized the significance. The Nexus Codex was one of the most valuable artifacts in known space, an ancient data matrix containing the combined scientific knowledge of the first 5 spacefaring civilizations. That's what they're after, said Professor Kildare, her primary eyes widening in realization. The Academy administrators must have kept the display schedule classified, but somehow the Vrexians discovered it. They're not here for random pillaging. They are here specifically for the Codex. All the more reason to reach the archives first. Mason said, resuming their pace. If we can secure the Codex, we might be able to use it as leverage. They continued through the tunnels, eventually reaching a vertical shaft with a maintenance ladder that would take them up to the sublevels of the archives. As they began to climb, Trill, a gelatinous Morphean student who could alter their physical state, oozed back down the ladder in alarm. Movement above. Trill burbled, their translucent body flashing morning colors. Vrexians have already reached this section. Mason frowned. How many? 4 that I could detect, Trill replied. They appear to be cutting through the security doors of the archive antechamber. Mason thought quickly, mentally reviewing what he knew about hive species and their tactical patterns. They have probably sent advance teams to secure high-value targets while their main force subdues the general population. That means they're likely working with limited numbers in this section. He turned to the group. We need to split up. Professor Kildare, can you lead a team to the communication array? If you can get a message out to the Defense Force, we might at least prevent the Vrexians from leaving with whatever they steal. The Centaurian professor nodded. I'll need at least 3 students with technical aptitude. Several volunteers stepped forward, including Zix, whose Avarian dexterity would be useful for the delicate work of bypassing damaged systems. The rest of us, Mason continued, will create a diversion and try to reach the Codex before the Vrexians can secure it. Kelvax, who had been studying Mason with increasing interest, spoke up. These tunnels were designed for maintenance, yes. That means they should connect to the environmental systems of the archives. They do, confirmed Professor Kildare. The archive has specialized atmospheric controls to preserve the physical artifacts. A predatory smile spread across the Draconian's face, revealing rows of metallic teeth. Then perhaps we can give these invaders a taste of their own medicine. Human, your atmospheric trick in the classroom was not without merit. I believe we can expand upon it. For the first time since the invasion began, Mason felt a spark of hope. The diverse abilities of his classmates, once a source of his own feelings of inadequacy, now represented their greatest strength. Okay, he said, here's what we're going to do. 20 minutes later, Mason crouched in an access duct directly above the main archive chamber, watching the scene unfold below. 4 Vrexian soldiers had secured the room, posting guards at each entrance while a 5th, clearly a specialist of some kind, worked to deactivate the security field surrounding the Nexus Codex. The Codex itself was smaller than Mason had imagined, a crystalline dodecahedron, no larger than a human fist, rotating gently within its protective field. Despite its modest size, it pulsed with an inner light that seemed to contain entire galaxies of information. Beside him, Kelvax and Trill waited for his signal. The rest of their team was positioned at strategic points throughout the surrounding ducts and maintenance corridors. Remember, Mason whispered, timing is everything. If we mess this up, we won't get a second chance. Kelvax rumbled his acknowledgement, while Trill rippled in what Mason had come to recognize as their equivalent of a nod. Through his earpiece, Professor Kildare's voice came through. Communications team in position. Security systems are partially responsive. We can trigger the protocols on your mark. Stand by, Mason replied softly. He watched as the Phyrexian specialist made progress on the security field, its multifaceted eyes gleaming with anticipation as the protective barrier began to flicker. Now, Mason whispered into his comm. Immediately, the archive's atmospheric systems roared to life, not in the purge mode they'd used in the classroom, but in a precisely calibrated sequence that Professor Vex, their atmospherics instructor, had helped them program. The chamber below was suddenly filled with a rapidly shifting mixture of gases. First, a fog-like vapor that obscured vision, then a compound that interfered with the electromagnetic frequencies the Phyrexians used for short-range communication. The Phyrexian soldiers chittered in confusion, their coordinated movements becoming jerky and uncertain as their ability to communicate was disrupted. In the same moment, the archive's lighting system began a seizure-inducing strobe effect that targeted the specific visual frequency most disruptive to Phyrexian compound eyes. It was harmless to most other species, but profoundly disorienting to the invaders. Phase 2, Mason ordered. Trill flowed through a narrow vent grating that no solid being could have navigated, reforming inside the archive chamber near the environmental controls. The Morphean extended pseudopods to the manual override switches, activating the specialized defensive measures that were usually reserved for containing hazardous artifacts. Localized gravity fields activated in unpredictable patterns across the chamber floor, causing the Phyrexian soldiers to stumble as their weight suddenly multiplied or nearly vanished with each step. With the Phyrexians disoriented and their coordination broken, Mason and Kelvax made their move. They dropped from the access duct, with Kelvax targeting the two guards nearest the entrance, while Mason went for the specialist still working on the Codex's security field. The Draconian was a blur of metallic scales and controlled fury, his natural armor giving him a significant advantage in close-quarters combat. He slammed into the first guard with enough force to send it crashing into a display case, then pivoted to engage the second before it could bring its energy weapon to bear. Mason took a more strategic approach. Rather than attacking the specialist directly, he targeted the equipment it was using to breach the Codex's defenses. A precise kick sent the delicate interface device skittering across the floor, where it was promptly crushed under a gravity fluctuation. The specialist whirled to face him, mandibles clicking in rage. It lunged with surprising speed, natural claws extended. Mason sidestepped, using the Phyrexian's momentum against it, a basic principle from his Earth defense training. As the specialist stumbled past, Mason struck at the neural cluster at the base of its carapace, just as he'd seen Professor Keldra do earlier. The Phyrexian didn't go down, but it staggered, giving Mason precious seconds to speak into his comm. Professor, now. Throughout the archive, emergency containment fields sprang to life, not the passive security barriers that had protected the artifacts, but aggressive isolation fields designed to contain potentially dangerous relics. Each Phyrexian suddenly found itself trapped in a shimmering energy bubble that contracted to conform precisely to its body shape, effectively immobilizing it. The specialist fighting Mason screeched in frustrated rage as the field enveloped it, its limbs freezing in mid-strike just centimeters from Mason's face. Containment successful, Professor Keldra reported through the comm. We've also managed to send a priority distress signal. Union defense forces are responding and will arrive within the hour. Mason allowed himself a moment of relief before focusing on their most immediate concern. What about the Codex? Is it secure? The original security field was compromised, Professor Keldra replied, but the secondary containment is holding. The Codex is safe for now. Before Mason could respond, a new sound cut through the chamber, a deep, resonant vibration that he felt more than heard. The containment fields around the captured Phyrexians flickered. What's happening? He demanded. Unknown energy signature approaching the archives. Professor Keldra responded, her voice tight with renewed tension. It's massive, and the readings suggest it's a Phyrexian command node. Through the archive's main entrance came a new figure, larger than the soldiers, its exoskeleton, a complex fusion of organic chitin and advanced cybernetics. Unlike the somewhat insectoid appearance of the soldiers, this entity's form was more arachnoid, with multiple limbs radiating from a central body mass that housed what appeared to be extensive computational systems. "Coordinator," whispered Kelvax, who had dispatched his opponents and rejoined Mason. "The central intelligence of this invasion force." The coordinator paused, its sensor arrays scanning the chamber. When it spoke, it did so not through translator devices, but directly into their minds, a disorienting psychic broadcast that somehow conveyed meaning despite crossing species barriers. "You resist. INEFFECTED. IVAOI. The NEXUS will be ours. It is inevitable." The containment fields around the captured Vrexians collapsed completely. The soldiers immediately regrouped around their coordinator, forming a protective phalanx. Mason felt a chill run down his spine. This was no longer a simple matter of outlasting an invasion until help arrived. The coordinator's presence changed everything. Its psychic abilities and advanced technology made it a threat of an entirely different magnitude. "Professor," he said urgently into his comm, "we need options. This thing just walked through our containment fields like they weren't even there." There was a moment of silence before Professor Kelder responded. "The archive has one final defense protocol, but it's extreme. It would trigger a complete molecular encryption of all artifacts in the collection, rendering them temporarily unusable, even to us. The encryption key would be automatically transmitted to Union headquarters, meaning no one could access the artifacts until the proper authorities arrived with the decryption sequence." "Would it stop the Vrexians from taking the codex?" Mason asked. "They could still physically remove it, but the data within would be inaccessible. Essentially a beautiful but worthless crystal until decrypted." The coordinator had begun moving toward the codex, its soldiers clearing a path. Whatever defenses they tried to activate seemed to fail before they could even fully deploy. Mason made his decision. "Do it." "There's a manual override required," Professor Kelder said. "Someone has to physically activate the sequence from the main archive control station. The automated systems have been compromised." Mason looked across the chamber to where the control station stood, directly in the path of the advancing Vrexians. "I'll do it," Kelvax said unexpectedly. Before Mason could object, the Draconian added, "My natural armor gives me the best chance of reaching it." Mason wanted to argue, but the logic was sound. "Okay, but you'll need a diversion." He turned to Trill, who had reformed beside them. "Can you create a sensory disruption? Something to confuse their coordination." The Morphian's body rippled with bioluminescent patterns. "I can become a dispersal medium for sonic interference. It won't stop them, but it might disorient them briefly." "That's all we need," Mason said. He looked at Kelvax. "On my signal, go for the control station. Trill and I will keep them occupied." The Draconian nodded, tensing for his dash. "Professor," Mason said into his comm, "be ready to input the encryption command the moment Kelvax activates the manual override." "Standing by," came the tense reply. Mason took a deep breath, then gave the signal. "Now." Trill's gelatinous body suddenly expanded, filling a large portion of the chamber with a fine mist that carried ultrasonic vibrations specifically calibrated to interfere with the Vrexians' neural communication. At the same time, Mason charged directly at the coordinator, not to attack it. That would have been suicide, but to force it to focus its formidable attention on him rather than on Kelvax's dash to the control station. The coordinator's psychic voice boomed in Mason's mind. "Primitive organism. Your story TGUA is TRANSPARENT." "Maybe," Mason replied, dodging the grasping limbs of a soldier. "But sometimes the obvious move is still the right one." Kelvax had almost reached the control station when the coordinator seemed to realize the true threat. It turned with surprising speed, extending a specialized limb that crackled with energy. Without hesitation, Mason threw himself into the path of that deadly appendage. The energy struck him full force, sending him crashing to the floor in agony. But his sacrifice had served its purpose. Kelvax reached the control station and slammed his scaled fist down on the override. "Now, Professor," the Draconian roared. Throughout the archive, a wave of blue-white energy cascaded over every artifact, including the Nexus Codex. The Coordinator screeched in rage as the Codex's internal light dimmed, its vast store of knowledge locked away behind impenetrable encryption. The Vrexian soldiers surrounded Mason, weapons ready. The Coordinator loomed over him, its psychic voice filled with cold fury. "You, HFY we will still take the NEXUS, and we break its ENCRYTVIA. We will rari may MBRU." Despite the pain radiating through his body, Mason smiled. "You might want to reconsider that plan." At that moment, the Archive's communication array activated, projecting a holographic message throughout the chamber. It showed a Union Defense Force fleet dropping out of hyperspace just beyond Argos Prime's atmosphere. Dozens of warships responding to Professor Kildra's distress call. "Your invasion force is about to be trapped in this system," Mason said, struggling to his feet. "Whatever plans you had for a quick raid just failed. You can still leave with your soldiers, or you can stay and face the full might of the Union Defense Force when they arrive in approximately." He checked his datavat. 12 minutes. The Coordinator stood motionless, its sensor arrays processing this new information. Then, without warning, it broadcast a series of commands that caused its soldiers to immediately disengage and begin retreating. "You have not won, human. You have merely survived." "Sometimes," Mason replied. "That's enough." As the Vrexians retreated, Kelvax and Trill rushed to Mason's side, supporting him as his legs threatened to give way. "That," said the Draconian with newfound respect, "was either the bravest or most foolish thing I have ever witnessed on Earth." Mason said with a pained grin, "We just call it Thursday." Professor Kildra's voice came through the comm, relief but urgent. "Union forces are boarding the Academy. The Vrexians are withdrawing to their ships. It appears we've done it." In the days that followed, as Union peacekeepers secured the Academy and medical teams treated the injured, the story of the human exchange student and his classmates spread throughout the campus. What had begun as a routine lecture had transformed into a crucible that forged unexpected bonds between species that had previously regarded each other with indifference or disdain. During the official debriefing, Admiral Thrix of the Union Defense Force asked the question that was on everyone's mind. How did a group of untrained students manage to repel a Vrexian raid force and protect one of the most valuable artifacts in the galaxy? Before Mason could respond, it was Kelvax who answered. "The human taught us something that all our advanced technology and theoretical knowledge had not," the Draconian said, placing a clawed hand on Mason's shoulder. "He showed us that preparation for the worst, combined with the diverse strengths of united species, creates a resilience that no single approach could match." Professor Kildra nodded in agreement. "Perhaps we have been too quick to dismiss certain perspectives as primitive, simply because they developed along different lines than our own. The human instinct to prepare for adversity, even seemingly unlikely scenarios, proved invaluable." As the Academy slowly returned to normal operations, Mason found himself approached by students from all departments, eager to learn more about Earth's emergency protocols and defensive tactics. What had once been a source of ridicule was now recognized as a valuable complement to the more specialized knowledge taught at the Galactic Academy. In the newly reinforced lecture hall, Professor Kildra introduced a modified curriculum for the term. "Recent events have demonstrated that true interspecies understanding requires more than just diplomatic theory," she announced to the packed classroom. "From now on, this course will include practical exercises in cross-species crisis response, beginning with simulations developed by our colleagues on Earth." As Mason took his seat, now surrounded by friends rather than skeptics, he couldn't help but smile at the irony. He had come to the academy to learn from the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, only to end up teaching them one of humanity's most fundamental lessons: always be prepared. Zix leaned over, feathers shimmering with amused colors. You realize you've completely ruined the curve for this class, right? Mason laughed. Just wait until we get to the zombie apocalypse protocols. That's when things get really interesting. The lecture hall, once filled with dismissive laughter at human primitiveness, now filled with genuine laughter of camaraderie and mutual respect, perhaps the most valuable lesson the academy had taught in generations.